Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altmann, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Tim Duy, Director of the Oregon Economic Forum and Adjunct Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Oregon. Before joining the UO faculty, Duy worked as an economist with the U.S. Treasury Department, analyzing U.S. trade issues, and as a private consultant in Washington, D.C., providing political and economic advice to financial institutions. The Economic Forum produces the UO Index of Economic Indicators, the Central Oregon Business Index, and the Lane County Business Index. Tim regularly blogs on economic issues on Tim Duy's FedWatch and on Economist's View. Tim, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you for having me.
You must be a very busy guy these days.
Well, there is no shortage of work to do and no shortage of speaking engagements. There's no doubt about that. So
yeah.
It keeps me moving.
Your expertise is probably at its highest ever premium just at the moment.
It's almost not sad, but you know that you have to get to this point in the economy, and then suddenly your popularity rises suddenly. But you know you sort of have to keep it in perspective of why you're being asked so much, and because the conditions are so very difficult.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad we pinned you down for today before things got even worse. Tim, I wanted to jump right in by asking you to tell us about the UO Index of Economic Indicators and specifically what measures you use to figure that out.
Right. Well, the index was an effort to create a snapshot of monthly economic activity. We all know that the paper reports on various economic indicators almost daily. But most people don't have a sense of how all those fit together because they don't follow the data as closely as somebody like myself does. So I wanted to create a mechanism that could really sort of have an opportunity to pull all the data together and hopefully explain it in a coherent fashion for the public. And so that's really what started the project. Where we've gone from there is to where we went from the idea is to put it into use, and that was to collect some indicators that we thought were cyclical in nature, that basically are telling us whether the economy is going up or down, which is being the key idea of an index, try to get the state of the economy. So we focused on a couple labor market indicators, on initial unemployment claims, which tend to be a leading indicator, and employment services, payrolls, which is largely temporary help agencies, and again, a leading indicator. Generally, first workers be fired are the temp workers, and the first to be hired back are the temp workers. We also look at core manufacturing orders, consumer confidence, Oregon weight distance tax, the spread between long and short-term interest rates. And so we cobble together these 7 indicators and create a single measure out of those indicators.
Most of them are transparent for someone who's not an economist, but I, for example, don't know what the weight distance tax is. Could you explain that?
There's a tax on trucking activity through Oregon, essentially is what it amounts to, how heavy your load is and how long it's moving. And so that's a measure of essentially how much shipping activity is going on. And right now that number has been in decline for the last couple of months, which isn't a big surprise given the downturn in the global economy starting the fourth quarter last year.
2 other questions before I ask you what the current indices are actually telling us. First of all, you said we. Can you explain who's involved in tracing these
We is largely
measures?
me.
We is largely
we
you?
is largely me. I think of we as the university sense, but the we is me. Generally, it's something I put together. I've added in a measure of recession probabilities. Basically, what's the probability that Oregon is in recession at any given time? And that is created by Professor Jeremy Piger in our department. And so I've borrowed some of his work to put together, but largely it's my doing.
Okay, thank you. That's a good start. And then my second question, which is the other part of the other side of the coin, is who is your primary audience for this?
The general public, business audience, government leaders, anybody that really wants to get an idea of what the direction of the economic activity is.
Okay, well then that's the perfect segue. What is the general direction of the economy?
General direction is not good.
Yes.
I've seen better data.
Wow.
The index was up a little bit in January, but largely because December was so terrible. Really wasn't signaling that there's going to be any kind of near-term improvement in economic activity. What it said is a couple things didn't get much worse. Initial jobless claims, for example, came down a little bit, but they're at very elevated levels, well above what we saw in the last recession, which says that the pace of firings in January was quite significant. A similar one that came up a little was the employment services payroll, edged up a little, but after a very, very weak December. So some of the things we didn't get as bad as could have, but that's sort of a thin reed to hold on to, a thin straw to grasp, right, as you're thinking about the economy. The general outlook is actually quite dark for the first half of this year at least.
For the first half of 2009?
Hopefully some of the cyclical effects we have will start to wear themselves out by the end of this year. And we should have substantial fiscal stimulus coming from Washington to help support economic activity. But the kinds of downturns we saw emerge in the fourth quarter of last year generally take at least 3 to 4 quarters to start to pass through the system. Again, this is going to be a long, deep recession by the time we get out of it. Probably on the order of the worst since the Great Depression.
Well, there it is in a nutshell. Do you have the opportunity, or is it worthwhile to compare what's happening in Oregon with what's happening in neighboring states or other states in the country?
I don't focus on the neighboring states as much. I really sort of put my focus on Oregon and the U.S. Obviously, our neighbors to the north and south are as challenged, if not more challenged, on certain levels than Oregon. California has a huge budget gap. They've been struggling to close. They were heavily hurt by the housing downturn, even more so than we were. Washington is now being hurt because airline orders are slowing up. So you've got Boeing, you've got Microsoft laying off jobs, which was previously thought of just basically unheard of. So there's problems north and south of us as well. On average, Oregon is being hurt more than the rest of the nation, which is why our unemployment rate has risen so high so quick.
And why are we being hurt more? I'll leave you the time to have a sip of water, but can you pinpoint what factors are making it worse in Oregon than elsewhere?
Why are we more cyclically dependent than it seems other places are? One was a traditional reliance on manufacturing, so you have a large number of small manufacturers in the state that might not be able to weather these kinds of downturns as well as a large manufacturer. We still have a certain dependence on wood products, and that's certainly been hit hard as the housing downturn has moved forward. Some of the industries that we have proven to be very cyclical. For example, the RV industry obviously is a very challenged industry if consumers are not willing to make that kind of purchase. And it's not clear that going forward they're going to be willing to make those purchases again, or to the extent that they were. So that, fundamental changes there. There might be more underemployment here that essentially leaves people more vulnerable. As you have more people moving to Oregon, maybe taking a job that's really below their qualifications just to be in Oregon, and they might be in a less stable job as a result of that, and so you get that effect as well. So I think there's a number of reasons to pinpoint to suggest that the economy is just fundamentally more volatile than the nations as a whole.
Thank you. That's actually a very helpful description for me. I think I finally understand why we're more vulnerable. You said a few minutes ago that the magnitude of this particular crisis is, to your mind, probably second only to the Great Depression, and we're hearing that comparison in a lot of the media. You also have an international piece element to your financial expertise, and people are drawing parallels between the current financial crisis in the U.S. and what happened in Japan in the 90s. Do you think that that is a worthwhile comparison?
Now. Early on, it shouldn't have been. It shouldn't have been because there were some key differences between the U.S. and Japan. Early on in the crisis, I would tell you that Japan did not fix their banking system quick enough, and that was a problem. And I would tell you that we weren't going to make that same mistake. Okay, that was wrong. we chose to make that same mistake. Japan, in some sense, was better positioned because they could rely on the rest of the world for external growth. And we had that opportunity too until the global economy collapsed. Now we don't have that anymore. So in that sense, we're actually worse than Japan going forward. And to see sort of how that reflects is Japan had a terrible fourth quarter because they don't have the rest of the world to rely on anymore either. And it took them a long time to get their banking system relatively fixed. I don't think they've still got it completely fixed, especially after this last wave of financial crisis. So I do think there's a lot of parallels to this situation and that situation.
One of your recent blogs, I think it was February 24th, one of your entries was about banks behaving badly. Do you think that we're on the road to beginning to fix that problem?
No, we have the banks behaving badly piece was the problem that we've had is we don't really have a plan, right? So for example, in the original TARP money, they sort of spread it around to banks that didn't really need it. Well, you can't. Once a bank takes government money, they have to at least act in some kind of a system.
Let me stop you just long enough to ask you to explain TARP.
Oh, the Troubled Asset Relief Program.
Thank you.
The idea was to provide some capital to the banking system. We don't really entirely know what the idea is because it changed so many times as to what it was, but it was a pot of money set aside to try to stabilize the banking system. And one of the decisions that was made early on was to use it to provide capital to banks, whether they wanted it or not. And some banks, like Northern Trust in that example in the blog, took the money and they didn't really need it, but they felt like they had to take it. Now, of course, then this creates a problem with you've given money to somebody who didn't really need it or want it to begin with when it could have been redistributed somewhere else. And two, it sort of interferes with how the bank really might want to do their business because they can't. In that case, they took a large number of clients to a large weekend of festivities in Los Angeles, which is fine on your own money, but once you've accepted the government's money, at least creates an image of something that you want to be careful to avoid. And I think some banks have avoided doing that for a reason. They don't want the public display. And so for that issue, I thought is what we talked about in that blog, but it was more of the populist outrage side of me.
Blogs are very well suited to that, and I want to get back to that in a minute. But just before we leave the topic of regulations and governmental intervention, do you have your own pretty firm ideas of what sort of governmental policies will provide real solutions? You have to start getting at the core of the problem, and that's that there's a huge number of bad assets on the balance sheets of banks, and particularly some banks. Not all banks, and not all banks are unstable, right? The focus has been on really some of the top banks, the biggest banks like Citibank, Bank of America as being some of the real troubled banks, and we need to sort of find a mechanism to either allow those banks that are in fact troubled to that extent go into receivership maybe and just sort of be reinvented, or we need to find a mechanism to pull those bad assets off their balance sheets, and recognize that the taxpayer will have to bear some cost of that. Somewhere along the way, we've got to make those moves that actually take the problem away, and we haven't done that. We've taken actions to keep things from getting worse in the hope that the problem would spontaneously go away on its own, and that hasn't worked. So you're thinking more active, more controlled something that maybe the government, the political leadership of the country doesn't want to do right now, for fear that you will collapse the banking system. And although arguably with Citibank stock trading below $1 today, the banking system is already collapsing. Or certain aspects of it. Again, I don't want to draw broad strokes over the entire banking industry because there are a number of banks that are relatively healthy and would survive.
we're really thinking about some key players in the industry when we make these discussions, or large players, maybe not key anymore.
So we've talked about banking a little bit, and you mentioned in passing the housing industry and how badly various states have been affected by that particular crash. Are there other sectors of the economy that you think we need to be focusing on more? Certainly we've heard a lot about the auto industry.
Right. I would argue that one of the fundamental problems that we're facing right now is, for the past 20, 25 years, we have really changed the structure of the economy to focus on providing consumer goods, whether we've made them here or not. And that process has run its course. We can't expect the consumer activity to be an ever-growing share of economic activity. In fact, in order to get it to be this large, we had to foist a whole bunch of debt, essentially, onto households. And households can't absorb any more debt. Their assets that they have really broken down in value. And consequently, you really see a period of time in which that retrenchment leads to a reduction in the consumer part of the economy. But we don't have a system that easily replaces that. That's the challenge right now. So what you end up with is the government trying to fill the gaps until either investment spending rises, and that's a challenged sector right now, because not exactly sure what you should invest for. If it's not to be consumer, what will it be, or how will it be? Or exports, which would be fine if the global economy wasn't in such bad shape. And so that's where you get to these situations where what is the way out? And if it's a very prolonged or protracted way out, then you have to expect a large role of the government to fill those holes until we can get to the other side.
You mentioned an over-reliance on consumer products. This all speaks to the larger question of ingrained consumerist patterns that Americans, at least, and other countries of the first world have adopted very freely. What kind of changes do you think there are going to have to be for the average household in their patterns of consumption?
I think that the average household is going to have to reconsider how much of their income they spend versus save. That might include, I would say, less luxury goods, maybe fewer vacations, less expensive automobiles, right? Maybe smaller homes in the future rather than the bigger homes. I mean, basically a whole scaling back of our consumer lifestyles. And you see that, I think, occurring, where people are, in fact, reevaluating where they are and how they got there, and not just in the sense of they're worried about their jobs, but just in the sense of maybe I haven't been saving enough for the future, given there's more uncertainty than I realized. And so that's, I think, for the average household, a process that they're undergoing at this time.
Do you think it's a painful process?
It is. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it that it's less fun to save money than spend money at a certain level for most consumers. And there's no doubt about it that it creates a significant problem for the economy. If everybody saves at once, then there is that lack of demand. There's that hole that suddenly opens up. And we don't have an easy way of channeling that into some other spending. And that's where the pain comes in, is you drop demand all of a sudden, and there's no replacement for it.
Yeah, so it seems as though all of the precautionary measures we can take simply feed into the larger problem,
what
right?
we call the paradox of savings.
The paradox,
is what's good for one of us to do, if we all did it at the same time, is not good for us to do. So in the long run, it's where we need to go. It's getting the transition from the short run to the long run right that helps you minimize that pain. And the only way we really know how to do that is for the government to spend a lot of money. And it's not clear the government has chosen to spend the amounts of money necessary to really smooth that transition yet. And that would be a very common mistake, too. Japan never spent the amount of money they would need to as well.
So the common mistake, just to make sure I understand you, is not to spend enough. It's to be too cautious.
To be too cautious and not aggressive enough. And you could argue that some people would say the New Deal didn't work because unemployment stayed high for a long time, even though it came down from its peak. And I think the counter-argument is, if it didn't work, or didn't work as effectively as people wanted, it was because we didn't do it enough. We didn't really pull out of the Great Depression fully until we got to World War II, and we had no choice but to spend massive amounts of money.
Mm. So most of what we've been talking about is applicable at least to this country from coast to coast. What about more locally? Do you have any firm opinions about statewide and even local Eugene Willamette Valley recovery?
Locally, it's so much more difficult because we don't have the borrowing mechanisms that the federal government does. And there's almost no way to avoid pain than to fill our gaps. Either you have to raise taxes or cut spending. Right? One way or another, you had to fill that gap. And there'll be pain involved in either mechanism. And we might have to really sit down and rethink what are the goals of the government and have an honest talk about what we think those goals are and what we're willing to pay for those goals. And we don't necessarily have those talks when things are going well. So I think that there are real serious concerns in trying to bridge that gap between where we think we should be spending and where the money is.
Do you think those difficult conversations are taking place even now?
Oh, I think they're starting to. I think they're starting to in Salem because you've got $3 billion or more of a hole to fill, and the federal government is not ready to make that up yet. And so again, those are big holes in the next biennium, and that's a huge challenge, I think, for our elected officials to get wrap their minds around.
I wanted to ask you about the forms in which the media in which you get out your forecasting, your interpretation, what you have to offer in terms of the indices. It seems to me that blogging is probably the perfect medium at the moment because it's so immediate.
Right, right.
Is that one of the
It's not the perfect
uses?
medium, but it's certainly one of those. It's immediate. You do have to be, I think, careful because it is something that you can not fully consider. At least when I do the index, I have a couple days. It goes back and forth. I think about it. Goes through editing. But the blogging is different because you can, in fact, write too quickly, and I think there's some danger in being an instant pundit. So I think there's that caution. On the other hand, as far as a commitment mechanism to make you stay aware, make you be involved in what people are talking about. I think it's very useful from that perspective. The blog is a great device. It's benefited me. I use largely through a blog that's run by another economist, Economist View, another economist, Mark Thome at the university here. And that has been a very successful blog for him. And it lets you reach an audience I think would be very difficult to reach from Oregon alone.
Could you give the name of that blog?
Economist View.
Okay, Economist View. Yeah, and you're linked to it, right?
And I'm linked to it. Mark usually echoes my posts on his blog as well.
There's sort of an ephemeral quality to blogging that means that people have to take it with a large grain of salt, right? It's that impermanence, or that you called it, what did you call it? Punditry.
Yeah, there is. I mean, that's... You can see on given days people write very well, and other days they don't, and it becomes sort of I think as the author you try to be aware of that you can write things in haste that then you say, wait a second, and you can always pull it down, but sometimes you make a mistake, you own up to it, right? You just sort of leave it there, and and it always serves as a reminder saying, maybe I didn't really want to say that, but I did anyway.
Yeah. Before we started taping, we were talking about how hard it is to stay up with the changing situation because it is evolving so rapidly. How you must spend most of your day just trying to keep up with the news sources.
Well, you almost have to, in a sense. You have to be, there'll be a policy announcement every day that's of some significance, and I have gained a sort of a new appreciation for the people that are really good at keeping up with things like that. When you've got other work to do, it's easy to let things start to fall through the crack, and so, in fact, you do spend a lot of time at night, which is the catch-up time to try to figure out all the day's events and try to put them together in some coherent framework, which is not easy to do at these times.
Yeah, I expect you're not getting a whole lot of sleep.
Yeah.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but I didn't want to close without asking you about your teaching, Tim, because I know you teach one course a year, but I'm really intrigued by the fact that, your course is economic forecasting, and I can't imagine a more topical but also more difficult course to be offering at the moment.
It is. I really enjoy that course. The students seem to get a lot out of it because I'm able to really use real-time examples and sort of take the knowledge that they've gained in some statistics classes they've had to take and say, okay, now you've had this knowledge. How do we implement that in a framework where, maybe it's a business where you have to forecast sales, or maybe it's a government job where you have to have some kind of idea about what the future is going to be. At least have some credible way to analyze that. And then, in some sense, even more important to say, once you have a forecast, knowing what went into that so that you can identify the risks of that forecast. So if something is going wrong, you can say, well, you know what, I shouldn't stick with this forecast. It needs to change because the world that I made it in has changed. And trying to drive those points forward, I think is a very valuable lesson for the students, to show them the limitations as much as the powers.
So you're teaching them to be more critical users of that kind of information.
Exactly. It's not meant to be, here's a methodology that you can use flawlessly. Go from A to B to C, you're done.
Yeah.
It's go from A to B to C, and then think of, C1 and C2 and C3, and how those could affect, your outlook.
Last question, Tim. I heard a piece on National Public Radio about enrollments booming in economics classes because all the students want to know what's going on. Have you seen that here?
Yeah, we have over 700 majors now, and it just seems like a couple of years ago we had 500. So certainly part of that's just the organic growth of the university, but part of it's too just the enhanced interest in the subjects.
Yeah, I can't think of anything more relevant for a student to want to be studying right now.
No, it's true.
Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us for a half hour. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We've been speaking with Tim Duy, Director of the Oregon Economic Forum. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.